Blessings of the Triple Gem, Teruan Saranai. Hello friends, welcome back to our weekly slow sessions, our Metta Lab. Hope this finds you well. Let's begin by paying homage to the Triple Gem, homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dhamma, and homage to the Noble Sangha. So as you know, we are now looking at developing a mettācetovimutti, so liberation of the mind by loving kindness, as well as metta with the 7 enlightenment factors. And this is based on the Mettāsahagata Sutta, which is in Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 46, discourse number 54. So it's within the Bojjhangas Samyutta. And this is known as accompanied by loving kindness. So this is a step up from what we've developed so far, but my intention is to take it very gradually. So for today's session, we're going to start looking at the sutta, and we'll do a short meditation first, but after that we'll start going through the sutta. And in today's session, we're going to pause by looking at what it means to develop liberation of mind by loving kindness. So what does the sutta say about why it's important to develop this, and certain other interesting facts. And the way I see it is encouragement for us to want to develop it, to want to aspire to keep developing loving kindness to a higher degree. Let's look at how to get the best out of this session. So I know I go through this every time, but I find that it just brings our mind into the session and away from how our week has been and all those sorts of different kinds of things. So the first thing is to keep an open mind, to take the Buddha's words fresh. So with this new sutta, particularly so, and to remember that our intent is to go from start to finish and to take the Buddha's instructions, because that is where the mastery is to actually see what the Buddha actually says and how he instructs us to develop the mind. And along the way, of course, we give up unskilled states, and it's good to remember that maybe I have unskilled states that are preventing me from this path, from developing the mind. And then be okay with not understanding everything. So sometimes we feel apprehensive because maybe, for example, our metta practice isn't that strong. But one of the things is to lean in and to understand that this is a gradual practice. So we train together, and gradually, bit by bit, we make progress. So lean into any new Pali words, any new suttas, and be happy with whatever is possible for this session. Remember also that we're all learners, so we come together to make right effort, to lean on each other, as well as to encourage each other on the path, because we know in our daily life it's not so easy. We get pulled in all sorts of different directions. And of course, apply yourself to any meditations that we do. And of course, use your own examples. As we've said, this is the opportunity for self-care, that when we clean the mind, we're able to calm it, concentrate it, develop it, and then uplift it. So again, take the temperature of what the mind is like coming into this session. And by the end of the session, also take another sort of gauge. How is it now? Has it calmed down? Has it been purified? Those sorts of things. And then lastly, have good wishes for everyone. We know that it's not easy to come to this path, and then when we're on this path, we need the support of others. So there are probably people in our lives that has helped us, from teachers to parents to our partners to even our children. So anyone who has helped, any good friends, and anyone who's on the session today, have good wishes and gratitude. I thought we'd begin by doing a short meditation just to lift the mind. So whatever method you wish to use, whether it's karaniya metta or whether it's dukkha patipada dandapanya, so the painful practice with slow realization, I was thinking we'd do 5 to 10 minutes meditation just to purify and cleanse the mind, lift it up. And in that way, when we start this new sutta, the mind has lifted in a way that helps us to penetrate the Dhamma. So let's do this meditation now, and I'll call us out in 5 to 10 minutes. Theruwan Saranai, wishing you well. Blessings of the Triple Gem, Teruan Saranai, we can come out of the meditation. Today we're looking at this Mettāsahagata Sutta, so accompanied by loving kindness, and we know that this sutta is contained within the Bojjhanga Samyutta of the connected discourses. And what's very interesting is within this particular Samyutta, it is also, there are suttas about what are the nutriments for the hindrances, what are the nutriments for the bojjhangas, and then we have this particular sutta about developing metta with bojjhangas and reaching liberation of the mind by loving kindness, as well as the other Brahma Viharas as well. So it's a lovely sutta, and it's one that it's really important to take it quite slowly. And there's various ways of developing actually, and we're going to look at one particular way as we go through this Metta Lab. And it should be an enjoyable experience. So today's session is not going to be too heavy on learning the meditation. It's going to be more background and helping us to lean into wanting to do this meditation. And next week, it will be a little bit heavier in terms of looking at some of those concepts and Dhamma parts. But I don't think there's anything to be too fearful of. I think all these things that Buddha teaches us, they come together in a lovely package. And so we start to develop the 37 requisites of enlightenment just by trying to improve our mind and improve these pathways, these insight pathways. So the architecture for this sutta, it's a very good place to start, like what is this divided into? So the first part of the sutta is really the opening and the introduction to what has actually happened for this teaching to occur. So while out on alms round, a number of bhikkhus meet wanderers of other sects who question them about the lack of difference between the Buddha's teaching of the Brahmaviharas and their teaching of the Brahmaviharas. So here, the bhikkhus neither delight nor reject the statement made by the wanderers, and so they return to their own monastery. So they're staying in a particular place at that time. So then the second part of the sutta is when they return from the alms round, the bhikkhus then approach the Buddha, which is something that they would often do. And they reported the entire discussion with those wanderers to the Buddha. And then the Buddha instructs them on how to speak to those wanderers of other sects when they make such and such a statement about comparisons between the Buddha's teaching and that of their own teachings. And then the last part, which is the bulk of where we'll focus on when we look at the meditation, is where the Buddha then expounds on how to develop liberation of the mind by the Brahmavihara. So in this case, we're talking about liberation of the mind by loving kindness, by compassion, by altruistic joy, and by equanimity. And he specifically talks about what it has as its destination, its culmination, its fruit, and the final goal. So as I said before, in this Metta Lab, we're purely going to focus on liberation of the mind by loving kindness and as well as Metta with bojjhangas. And in a separate session, I'll look at the complete sutta, including how to develop all the other ones as well. So that gives you an idea about how this is set up. So we'll start with the sutta. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling among the Kolyans, where there was a town of the Kolyans named Halida Vasana. Then in the morning, a number of bhikkhus dressed and taking their bowls and robes entered Halida Vasana for alms. Then it occurred to them, it is still too early to walk for alms in Halida Vasana. Let us go to the park of the wanderers of other sects. Then those bhikkhus went to the park of the wanderers of other sects. They exchanged greetings with those wanderers, and when they had concluded their greetings and cordial talk, sat down to one side. The wanderers then said to them, Friends, the ascetic Gautama teaches the Dhamma to his disciples thus. Come, bhikkhus, abandon the 5 hindrances, the corruptions of the mind that weaken wisdom, and dwell pervading 1/4 with a mind imbued with loving kindness. Likewise the 2nd quarter, the 3rd quarter, and the 4th quarter. thus above, below, across, and everywhere, and to all as to oneself, dwell pervading the entire world with a mind imbued with loving kindness, vast, exalted, measureless, without hostility, without ill will. Dwell pervading one quarter with a mind imbued with compassion, likewise the second quarter, the third quarter, and the fourth quarter, thus above, below, across, and everywhere, and to all as to oneself dwell, pervading the entire world with a mind imbued with compassion, vast, exalted, measureless, without hostility, without ill will. Dwell pervading one quarter with a mind imbued with altruistic joy, likewise the second quarter, the third quarter, and the fourth quarter, thus above, below, across, and everywhere, and to all as to oneself, dwell pervading the entire world with a mind imbued with altruistic joy, vast, exalted, measureless, without hostility and without ill will. Dwell pervading one quarter with a mind imbued with equanimity, likewise the second quarter, the third quarter, and the fourth quarter, thus above, below, across, and everywhere, and to all as to oneself, dwell pervading the entire world with a mind imbued with equanimity, vast, exalted, measureless, without hostility, without ill will. And then they say, we too, friends, teach the Dhamma to our disciples thus, and the entire thing is repeated. So, friends, what here is the distinction, the disparity, the difference between the ascetic Gautama and us? That is regarding the one Dhamma teaching and the other, regarding the one manner of instruction and the other. Then those bhikkhus neither delighted in nor rejected the statement of those wanderers. Without delighting in it, without rejecting it, they rose from their seats and left, thinking, we shall learn the meaning of this statement in the presence of the Blessed One. Then, when those bhikkhus had walked for alms in Halidavasana, and had returned from the alms round, after their meal they approached the Blessed One. Having paid homage to him, they sat down to one side, and reported to him the entire discussion between those wanderers and themselves. The Blessed One said, Bhikkhus, when wanderers of other sects speak thus, they should be asked, friends, how is the liberation of the mind by loving kindness developed? What does it have as its destination, its culmination, its fruit, its final goal? How is the liberation of the mind by compassion developed? What does it have as its destination, its culmination, its fruit, its final goal? How is the liberation of the mind by altruistic joy developed? What does it have as its destination, its culmination, its fruit, its final goal? How is the liberation of the mind by equanimity developed? What does it have as its destination, its culmination, its fruit, its final goal? Being asked thus, those wanderers would not be able to reply, and further, they would meet with vexation. For what reason? Because they would not be within their domain. I do not see anyone, bhikkhus, in this world with its devas, Mara, and Brahma, in this generation with its ascetics and Brahmins, its devas and humans, who could satisfy the mind with an answer to these questions, except the Tathagata, or a disciple of the Tathagata, or one who has heard it from them. So clearly, we're not going to go beyond this point of the sutta. Clearly, what the Buddha is highlighting here is how unique the Buddha's teaching is. Where he's going to show us is that this liberation of the mind by loving kindness is very unique. There's certain Dhamma points that even by doing Karaniya Metta Sutta, as well as Dukkha Patipada Danda Binya, so painful practice with slow realization as the base, what happens is there's certain insights that we get about, in particular, the noble truth of suffering, in particular about our misapprehension about the physical nutriment or the form, and also the importance of certain other things. The fact that we are deceived and we have birthed even this body based on lies and deception, and that when we understand that, then we start to develop further. And this is something that the Buddha is highlighting, that wanderers of other sects, they would not be able to understand that. They would not be able to answer the question that he's asked like how to develop the liberation of the mind by loving kindness, and not to even understand what is the goal of that. Now, what's interesting is in the next few suttas that we're looking at, some of this will become a little bit clearer why he says that. So let's turn to looking at what is the liberation of the mind by loving kindness. So in Pali, this is mettācetovimutti. So if we go to Patisambhidamagga, which is the path of discrimination or textual analysis that Venerable Sariputta has compiled, it's his analysis. When he refers to liberation of the mind by loving kindness, he says this: it is loving kindness since it treats kindly, namely, by rejecting in the case of all beings their oppression for their non-oppression, by rejecting their injury for their non-injury, by rejecting their disappointment for their non-disappointment, by rejecting their deprivation for their non-deprivation, by rejecting their harassment for their non-harassment, with the thought, let all beings be free from enmity and not bear hostility, have pleasure and not disappointment, have happiness and not pain in their minds. It is the mind that perceives this Dhamma. It is liberation since it is liberated from all obsession by ill will. Loving kindness and mind and liberation, this is the liberation of the mind by loving kindness. So we can see, even to the point that we've developed immeasurable metta, it's the base for this. Because when we do that, just like Venerable Sariputta is highlighting, when we apprehend the Dhamma correctly, when we have the skilled states, when we understand that we're all in the same boat with regard to when we birth this body, we're subject to aging, sickness, and death. We're all in that same boat. No one is free of that. Then what we wish when we develop the loving kindness is that we wish non-oppression for other living beings, non-injury for other living beings, non-disappointment for all living beings, for their non-deprivation, non-harassment, that at some point that they find true freedom from suffering. And so that's why when we wish sukhitatta, we're wishing them to be free from enmity, hostility, any aversion. We want them to find true safety and happiness. So the liberation of the mind is when the mind deeply absorbs into that, truly develops it, perfects it, that perceiving that Dhamma, then what happens is any obsession by ill will is removed at that point. And it's not nibbana, but it's leaning in that direction. And so the mind gets free from the obsession with ill will. Now, when we talk about the obsession with ill will, as we've gone along, particularly with Karaniya Metta Sutta, what we see is we have these mental stains, these defilements, these unskilled states. And at the physical level, it would mean we would kill, we would take what is not given, we would have sexual misconduct, or any kind of sensual misconduct, really. Then, when it comes to the verbal unskilled states, well, we would have harsh speech, we would have divisive speech, we would have lying, and of course, we would have frivolous or empty talk. And then at the mind level, of course, we would covet, because if there's me and mine, we would covet, and of course, there would be ill will, and that would be led by the wrong view. What we can see is that our normal state is to be imbued with ill will. Because of aging, there is ill will. And even when we get into various situations day to day, ill will arises very, very quickly because we covet for the things that we like and we don't abandon that. And so after some time, ill will arises, not understanding this aging phenomenon. So this gives you a bit of a picture about what liberation of the mind by loving kindness is. The mind gets freed from ill will because if we continuously repeat and practice loving kindness and understand in particular what we'll see later on is adding to it this impermanence, then we reach that liberated state. So it goes from the unliberated mind to the liberated mind. But liberation of the mind by loving kindness is only one of many, many liberations that the Buddha has taught. So this is a very interesting one. So why should we develop the liberation of the mind by loving kindness? Well, as we've just said, and this is also stated in Vibhanga, which is Abhidhamma, it says it's the state of loving kindness that has mental freedom from ill will. So most of us are afflicted, like on a daily basis. We're afflicted because our bodies are aging or sick. That's some kind of state that we don't find agreeable. The body becomes a disagreeable object, and so there's plenty of ill will. We abide in dukkha dukkata, painfulness and pain. Or we encounter things at work that are disagreeable to us. We've been told off. Someone didn't, you know, uh, do their job. Someone betrayed us. All kinds of different things in the workplace, at home, different relationships with our neighbors, with our community, with our parents. All kinds of things arise where ill will is an outcome for us. And so we don't have freedom from that. So the liberation of the mind by loving kindness, when we develop to that degree, there is respite. There is some kind of freedom. Like when we talk about vimutti, it's also emancipation, deliverance, and freedom. So this is something that is quite unique and quite helpful. And so when it says it is the escape from ill will, it truly is. And there's some other suttas that we'll read out that where it's questioned and what the Buddha has to say about that. And there's another sutta that is also within this particular chapter of the Bojjhanga Samyutta, which is the Ahara Sutta. And it says, frequent wise contemplation, so this is yoniso manasikara, to the liberation of the mind through loving kindness, is the denourishment that prevents unarisen ill will from arising, and arisen ill will from increasing and expanding. So it's very powerful when we apply yoniso manasikara, this wise contemplation, or when we wisely contemplate to the liberation of the mind by loving kindness, that we have this way of putting right effort, that it's not possible for unarisen ill will to arise, and anything that has arisen will not increase and expand. We can actually, in many ways, work on it. And then it also says here in Petakopadesa, what we do by developing the liberation of the mind by loving kindness is that we develop the non-hate path. So that's very evident. If we're attacking ill will, like we're removing it, abandoning it, then of course we come off the hate path and we go on to the non-hate path, so the adosa path. And it says that the fruit is rebirth in the Brahma world as one who has not yet perfected. So if we don't attain nibbana, then if we keep developing this liberation of the mind by loving kindness, then the fruit is rebirth in the Brahma world. And there's other suttas where we'll look at that it says that one, because we know that loving kindness, the fruit that can be attained is the fruit of non-returner. So the fruit of non-returner, if that is attained, then one can be reborn into the pure abode. So that is something that is quite significant. Now, also in Anguttara Nikaya, in the collected sort of part of the sutta, chapter 11, it says it's for the direct knowledge of lust. And we've touched on this before when we looked at profitable perceptions and also this painful practice with slow realization, that when we look at these perceptions of repulsiveness of the body or repulsiveness of food, things like that, it is for direct knowledge of lust. And that is a very significant thing because when we misapprehend these things associated with form, then when we misapprehend these things about form and physical nutriment, then that lust is still there. We never really overcome it. And so at the point of death, that becomes a huge problem for us because we would keep going towards form, still misapprehending it. So when we do meditation, such as painful practice with slow realization, and using that as the base for the liberation of the mind by loving kindness, we keep developing this direct knowledge of lust. And it's very, very significant for those that wish to attain nibbana, those that wish to attain to the fruit of non-return. And that's also explained in the Patisambhidamagga as well. It's listed there in the first chapter. Another interesting uh, sutta is this one in Majjhima Nikaya, and this is where a householder called Dasama of Ataka Nagara or Nagara, he came and asked Venerable Ananda about what are the different ways where an unliberated mind becomes a liberated one. And Venerable Ananda went through 11 types of liberations, and he explained one particular one, which is this, uh, or actually he explained the Brahma Viharas within that, but the liberation of the mind by loving kindness was one of the 11 ways. And what he was saying was it's one of the ways that an unliberated mind comes to be liberated, that they may serve as a doorway to Nibbana if one attains destruction of the taint. So we've said that before, like even developing painful practice with slow realization, that's a doorway to Nibbana because that develops immeasurable metta. From there, you develop this liberation of the mind by loving kindness. It has the bojjhangas accompanied with this loving kindness if we develop it correctly. And if one has the knowledge of the destruction of the taints and the skill, then it becomes more than a doorway to Nibbana. One can actually release from that. And that's quite evident in what Venerable Ananda has said in this Majjhima Nikaya discourse number 52. He's also said in that discourse that if one doesn't attain Nibbana but one still develops this liberation of the mind by loving kindness to such a strong extent, then the path and fruit of non-return can be realized. And at that point, one would be reborn into the pure abodes and one could finish it off from there. And then the last part was in this Metta Sutta, Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 8, discourse number 1, and also appears in the Metta Sutta. This is really about that there are blessings that are to be expected. So we can look at that again. So you've seen this slide before about the 11 blessings that come by developing the liberation of the mind by loving kindness. So often we talk about this as also available when we develop immeasurable metta, but the true strength of it comes from liberation of the mind by loving kindness, so mettācetovimutti. So the Buddha says, because when the liberation of the mind by loving kindness has been pursued, developed, and cultivated, made a vehicle and basis, carried out, consolidated, and properly undertaken, 11 benefits are to be expected. Towards the end of the suttas we're going through, I'm going to go through these words about being pursued, developed, and cultivated, made a vehicle and basis, carried out, consolidated, and properly undertaken. These are beautiful Pali words. We'll come to it towards the end. But in the Metta Sutta, which is in the chapter of eights, it only talks about 8 benefits. The 3 that are missing are these 3 here. One's mind concentrates easily, one's appearance becomes clear or bright, one dies unconfused. So those are the ones that are missing from that chapter 8 Metta Sutta. But the complete set of 11 benefits is in this Metta Sutta. So as we've said before, in relation to sleep, there are 3 benefits. So one sleeps happily, one wakes happily, one sees no bad dreams. And that's a significant thing. It's because one has no ill will towards any living being. Usually we are disturbed when we harness anger, hostility, all kinds of different things, competition, envy towards other living beings. And so our sleep is disturbed. The other benefits relate to being dear to humans, dear to non-humans, which also makes sense because when we cultivate metta, it's to all living beings, humans and non-humans. And it says here one is protected by devas. And that's because we have those skilled states, because we wish, we renunciate, we have non-ill will, and we also have a certain level of non-harm. And the non-harm gets more perfected at the level of liberation of mind by compassion. Now, the other one is fire, poison, and weapons cannot harm. And of course, as I read out before, one's mind concentrates easily, one's appearance becomes clear or bright, one dies unconfused, and if one doesn't penetrate to a higher state, one goes to the Brahma world. So you can see these things, they line up. And these are the things that when you think about our day-to-day afflictions, when you think about the amount of stress we go through in daily life and other kinds of things, even if you think about if the world goes to World War III, what's the harm in developing liberation of the mind by loving kindness? It would be for our benefit, because even if the world goes to war, there is certain protections that come from having not wanting to harm anyone in the world, not having ill will to anyone in the world, despite the world choosing to fight. Because the world is largely, as we've said before, it's imbued with greed, hatred, and delusion. And it's been like that in Sansara for a very long time. Now, if they haven't been taught the Buddha's teaching, then how are they going to come to the non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion path? And so we understand that. But if there are people in the world that can develop immeasurable metta, that can develop liberation of the mind by loving kindness, it's a blessing on the world. So I thought we'd go through a few other suttas where the Buddha specifically talks about mettācetovimutti, so this liberation of the mind by loving kindness. And it lends itself to all these different things that the Buddha said about blessings. So the first one is the Kula Sutta, and this is in this chapter on similes in the Samyutta Nikaya in chapter 20. And it's about the simile of thieves assailing or afflicting or trying to conquer families. So it says, at Savatthi, because just as it is easy for burglars to assail those families that have many women and few men, so too is it easy for non-human beings to assail a bhikkhu who has not developed and cultivated the liberation of the mind by loving kindness. Just as it is difficult for burglars to assail those families that have a few women and many men, so too is it difficult for non-human beings to assail a bhikkhu who has developed and cultivated the liberation of the mind by loving kindness. Therefore, bhikkhus, you should train yourselves thus. We will develop and cultivate the liberation of the mind by loving kindness, make it our vehicle, make it our basis, stabilize it, exercise ourselves in it, and fully perfect it. Thus should you train yourselves. So clearly the Buddha is saying here, he's giving this simile of thieves, that if there's very few men and quite a lot of women, of course, then it's easy for non-human beings to come and damage and afflict a person who hasn't developed liberation of the mind by loving kindness, just as similarly. But if one has more men and few women, then it's not so easy for non-human beings to come and afflict. And you see this like in meditators and those that follow the Buddha's path. Usually after a certain while, there's less affliction with human beings. I mean, not to say it doesn't happen. We have family altercations and we have things that happen at work and we get afflicted. But also in meditation, we have this propensity to say, oh, Mara's coming to annoy us or disturb the mind, or I'm getting picked on by non-human beings. Like sometimes you hear this amongst Kalyanamitas. And the remedy is really, as the Buddha has said, not to keep focusing on it, but really when the mind, because I think that the point is that when you think that non-human beings are assailing us, harming us, what does that sound like? That sounds like anger. He or she, even if it is a non-human being, has harmed me in the past, they're harming me now, and they'll harm me in the future. And so what the Buddha is saying is one must develop the liberation of the mind by loving kindness, because then it's not so easy. So I've had conversations with people who would often say, oh, I'm being disturbed in my mind. It's coming from a third party and it's not necessarily a human being. It's like something else. And fair enough. Maybe they have certain attainments and things like that. But the point is not to make more of it. It's to really heed what the Buddha is saying. Develop mettācetovimutti, because then you're protected, which is also a blessing of this practice. Then the other sutta, which is the one straight after, so there's three in the row that Buddha uses different similes or references to this mettācetovimutti. This one is called the Oka Sutta, and it's about mettācetovimutti being more fruitful than giving food as charity, which we've come across before. So here the Buddha says, at Savatthi, because if someone were to give away 100 pots of food as charity in the morning, 100 pots of food as charity at noon, and 100 pots of food as charity in the evening, and if someone else were to develop a mind of loving kindness, even for the time it takes to pull a cow's udder, either in the morning, at noon, or in the evening, this would be more fruitful than the former. Therefore, bhikkhus, you should train yourselves thus. We will develop and cultivate liberation of the mind by loving kindness, make it our vehicle, make it our basis, stabilize it, exercise ourselves in it, and fully perfect it. Thus should you train yourselves. So you see the repetition even in this last bit of Buddha really encouraging the repetition, the training, the development, the establishing, and then becoming perfect in it. Now, this example of giving away food, like as charity, like dana, it's very much like what the Buddha says in the Vilama Sutta about even this great offering by Vilama, even the feeding of those that have path and fruit, and making different kinds of offering. The one about offering food is really similar to these first few of feeding, but particularly Vilama's example. And as we know, the Buddha in a past birth, he was Vilama, and he was telling this to Anathapindika. And so we see even in Vilama Sutta, it's way up here. And so when we develop both immeasurable metta through karaniya metta, through painful practice with slow realization, the way we've learnt it, as well as this liberation of the mind by loving kindness, we actually develop the most meritorious in terms of how we develop the mind. So, again, the same reference of the time it takes to pull a cow's udder in reference to a mind with loving kindness. And also, we know that we always reflect on and contemplate the arising and passing away of this form as part of all our meditations to do with metta. So we have this perception of anicca just for the time of a finger snap, actually more when we do our meditation. So it's very, very fruitful. So again, we take away from this. This is our encouragement. It's very beneficial and supportive of our path to actually do these meditations, this liberation of the mind by loving kindness. And then the third sutta in that same chapter on simile says, at Savatthi, Bhikkhu, suppose there was a sharp-pointed spear, and a man could come along, thinking, I will bend back this sharp-pointed spear with my hand or fist, twist it out of shape, and twirl it around. What do you think, bhikkhus? Would it be possible for that man to do so? No, venerable sir. For what reason? Because it's not easy to bend back that sharp-pointed spear with one's hand or fist, to twist it out of shape, or to twirl it around. That man would only experience fatigue and vexation. So too, bhikkhus, when a bhikkhu has developed and cultivated the liberation of the mind by loving kindness, made it a vehicle, made it a basis, stabilized it, exercised himself in it, and fully perfected it, if a non-human being thinks he can overthrow his mind, that non-human being would only experience fatigue and vexation. Therefore, bhikkhus, you should train yourselves thus. We will develop and cultivate the liberation of the mind by loving kindness, make it our vehicle, make it our basis, stabilize it, exercise ourselves in it, and fully perfect it. Thus should you train yourselves. So I really like this particular simile because if you really try to bend a rod or a spear or some kind of metal thing, it's not easy. You get easily tired out. You wouldn't even really be able to bend it. And I like this in the sense of how the Buddha is really saying that this liberation of mind by loving kindness is such a powerful thing. And it's powerful because one develops it to the degree of non-ill will, like the obsession of ill will with any living being is removed. And not completely removed, but removed to the extent that's possible until the mind feels free of it. That's the liberation part. And because of that, that's how difficult it is for a non-human being to come and attack. The vibration is different. So we've said before, like elements go with like elements. So when we develop it in this way, it develops more to the state of a Brahma. Those that live in the Brahma realms, they have this type of state, mental state. And when non-human beings, whether they're in deva realms or other kinds of realms that may be able to vibrate at a particular thing, they won't be able to come and harm. It's just like the Buddha says, it is not possible to overthrow one's mind. They would get exhausted and fatigued and be thoroughly vexed trying to do it. And so it's like a protection. It's a real protection from mental harm, especially when sometimes we think, oh, something's coming to disturb my mind. And we don't know what that is. We think it's something or another. And Buddha is clearly saying it can be done. And we've read it in suttas before, where even Mara can come and invade a mind of someone who's meditating. But when the liberation of the mind is there by loving kindness or another liberation, but in particular this one, it's not possible for it to shake. And so that's something very, very useful and powerful and beneficial. So we come to this Nissaraniya Sutta, and we referred to it before about being the escape from ill will. So let's see what the Buddha says. The Buddha says, here a bhikkhu might say thus: I have developed and cultivated the liberation of the mind by loving kindness, made it my vehicle and basis, carried it out, consolidated it, and properly undertaken it, yet ill will still obsesses my mind. So sometimes it may happen like that, where we think that. He should be told, not so. Do not speak thus. Do not misrepresent the Blessed One, for it is not good to misrepresent the Blessed One. The Blessed One would certainly not speak in such a way. It is impossible and inconceivable, friend, that one might develop and cultivate the liberation of the mind by loving kindness, make it one's vehicle and basis, carry it out, consolidate it, and properly undertake it, yet ill will could still obsess one's mind. There is no such possibility, for this, friend, is the escape from ill will, namely, the liberation of the mind by loving kindness. So here the Buddha is really saying that if you have developed it correctly, then ill will not be able to obsess the mind, that it is just no such possibility towards any living being. And if it still invades the mind, like if one were to recall someone from the past, maybe it's a bully at school, or maybe it's a past colleague who betrayed, or maybe it's a parent who hurt. If one has properly developed the liberation of the mind by loving kindness, when you check, you know that that's not there. And so then that's your proof. And so it's quite an interesting one because it's a way of diagnosing whether our meditation is on the right track, whether we have developed it correctly, whether we have repeated and repeated. When you read Patisambhida Magga, which is attributed to Venerable Sariputta, whether it's to do with satipatthana, so the establishments of mindfulness, or the iddhipadas, the basis of spiritual power, or the bojjhangas, the seven factors of enlightenment, or whether it's to do with these liberations, Venerable Sariputta often talks about really repeating, practicing, going through these things, following what the Buddha says about it. And I'm going to go through some of these words that I've been reading out over and over again because this is what really should go into our mind about how we develop any of these meditations. And in particular, since we're talking about metta, metta is not something that we develop once or twice, or we develop once a week, or we don't develop from there. It's something that we need to keep developing on an ongoing basis until we become very, very proficient at it, where it becomes as it's said by the Buddha time and time again, it's our vehicle, it's our basis. We consolidate it and so on. So these are the words that Buddha says. So in the case of mettācetovimutti, the Buddha says, Metta no cetovimukti bhavita, so develop, bhavisati, bahulikata, so cultivate, bahulikata, which means make it our vehicle, yanikata, actually, yanikata is make it our vehicle. Vatukata, which is make it our basis. Anuttita, stabilize it. Parichitta, exercise ourselves in it and fully perfect it. Now, there are many, many different translations which I'll go through. So bhavita is normally develop. It could also mean train. So we train ourselves in this case, in mettācetovimutti, this liberation of the mind by loving kindness. So it's the early stages. Bahulikata, so we cultivate it, which can also be we practice it frequently or continuously, and there's a seriousness to it. And at that point, we become abundant in this practice of Metta Vimutti. Then Yani Kata means make it our vehicle. What does that mean? So we make a habit out of doing this practice of Metta Vimutti. We start to master the nuances of this mettācetovimutti. We're familiar with the steps and the qualities or characteristics in the mind of this liberation. And then vatukata, make it our basis. Well, our mind starts to steady on this liberation of the mind by loving kindness, that we start to practice it so thoroughly. So we're no longer someone that is new to it. We become a practitioner of it at this vatukata. Anuttita, when it says stabilize it, that means we steady ourselves. We can firmly establish our mind in this liberation of the mind by loving kindness. Our ground of liberation, the freedom from ill will or the obsession of ill will can be maintained. So that's how we stabilize it. And then parichitta is exercising ourselves in it, means we're able to consolidate that practice. So we become embraced in this practice. We're equipped to do this practice. There's a consolidation of knowing the insight pathway. And we conquer unskilled states through this practice. And then the last one is susamarada, and it says fully perfect in it. It means that we've properly undertaken the practice, that we've removed defilements. We're opposed to any of those defilements. We're very clear about that. We've abandoned those things and we apply appropriate energy towards this meditation. So, in that way, we become very well undertaken with this meditation and we have the right ideas or the right view that flows from this liberation of the mind by loving kindness. So, there's certain insights that come that are known. And once we attain this liberation, when we recall those insights, and they're very strong insights like aha moments, and still based on First Noble Truth of suffering, still based on profitable perceptions regarding this physical nutriment, then what happens is we get to the liberation quicker each time. So in the beginning, when we're at the bhavita stage, it feels like, oh, I've got to lift this. It's hard. We've got to train. We've got to memorize all those things. But by the time one is well established in this practice, if we've been to liberation one time, two time, three time, four time, then through the understanding of this meditation, the establishment of this meditation, having made it our basis, our vehicle, all those things, we can go to liberation very quickly. And so when you think about liberation, like the Buddha's taught many liberations in the suttas. And of course, like what we said, there were 11 that Venerable Ananda was talking about to this householder Dasama. But Venerable Sariputta in Patisambhidamagga talks about 68 plus 3 liberations. So there's many liberations that come to the mind, depending on what we meditate on. So this is one that we can use. Now, this sequence of bhavita, bahulikata, yanikata, vatukata, anuttita, parichitta, susamarada, this sequence is used by the Buddha quite often, and particularly in regard to mindfulness directed to the body, so kaya gata sati, and we touch on that in our painful practice with slow realization. Also, the Buddha uses this particular sequence when he refers to the iddhipadas, so bases of spiritual power. So when we want to develop these sorts of things, like the bases of spiritual power, it's the same thing, except in the case of how I was describing Metta Vimutti, it is particular to the Iddhipada. And of course, I've just spoken about liberation of the mind by loving kindness, but also applies to compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity as well. So you can see there is something where we need to apply effort. We need to ensure that we're applying our spiritual faculties to this meditation as well as our powers. And I touched on that in a previous meditation where I was answering questions about even how to extend our metta practice. But all these things are very applicable. Like all, what we find is all these requisites of enlightenment are all applicable and very useful and much needed in terms of how we develop pathways and doorways to Nibbana. So I thought I would just cover that for this session today. And I would end with just some of the verses from the Metta Sutta in Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 8, discourse number 1. And what it says here is just for us to contemplate. For one who ever mindful develops immeasurable loving kindness, the fetters thin out as he sees the destruction of the acquisitions. If, with a mind free from hate, one arouses goodwill toward just one being, one thereby becomes good. Compassionate in mind toward all beings, the noble one generates abundant merit. Those royal sages who conquered the earth with its multitudes of beings traveled around performing sacrifices, the horse sacrifice, the person sacrifice, Sammapasa, Vajrapeya, Niragala. All these are not worth a 16th part of a well-developed benevolent mind. Just as the hosts of stars cannot match a 16th part of the moon's radiance. One who does not kill or enjoin killing, who does not conquer or enjoin conquest, one who has loving kindness toward all living beings, harbors no enmity toward anyone. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So I thought I'd leave that there as inspiration for what we're going to develop next. We're going to actually look at how we actually develop metta with bojjhangas, mettācetovimutti in our next session. And we'll draw on painful practice with slow realization. It is helpful if you've listened to Bojjhanga 2 from Sutta Meditation series. Bojjhanga 2 gives an explanation about the bojjhangas that can be relatively helpful. I'll still go through metta with bojjhangas anyway, but it's helpful to understand these Dhamma parts of what the Buddha really means by developing the 7 factors of enlightenment. So if you do have time and you want to lightly listen, just to get those Pali words and the flavor of the 7 factors of enlightenment, if you haven't heard it before, or even if you have and you just want to refresh, have a listen to that. My aim is in the next session to go through a little bit of this pathway, the meditation that we're going to do, and pull in how we activate the bojjhangas. And in the subsequent session, I'll go through the section where the Buddha talks about patikula, so repulsive and unrepulsive. And I want to use Venerable Sariputta as the role model because he's excellent at being so wise about this. His Kayagata Sati is really wonderful. And the examples that are given in how he thinks would really inspire us to understand and penetrate this Dhamma. So that will be the week after. And then the week after that, we'll practice a little bit more. And if we need a further session, we'll do that. But then we'll also draw in the apex, which is Subha Vimukti, which is liberation. That is beautiful, and how loving kindness is reflected in that. So we'll go through that as well. So that's sort of like the gradual thing. If I find that next session we need a bit more time, then I'll extend it and repeat a few things. But if I feel like we're going well, then that would be how it looks like. Okay. So we can share the merit with all sentient beings, but first let's pay gratitude to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Noble Sangha, and gratitude to noble beings who are helping us with this Dhamma. And if you'd like to share merit or dedicate merit to departed relatives, please do so now. Just recall them to your mind. And we can share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem to all of you. Wishing you well. Teruan Saranai.